recording. And yeah, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. We are really looking forward to today's talk. But before we introduce our brilliant speaker, I just want to say a few words about Riot Science Club. We host weekly seminars that aim to provide training in reproducible, interpretable, open, and transparent science. All our events are free and open to anyone. Please check out our Twitter feed to get all the information about our seminars. And in terms of housekeeping, you can submit your questions in the Q&A message board, and Agatha and myself will feed those to the speaker at the end of the talk. So, and now to the main part of this event. Agatha, would you like to introduce our speaker for today?
Yeah, I can do that. I'm so happy that we have Alexander Refsum Jensenius today with us. Alexander is a music researcher and a research musician. He obtained his doctorate degree in music technology at the University of Oslo, and is now a professor in musicology, as well as director of the RITMO Centre for the Interdisciplinary Studies in Rhythm, Time, and Motion. And he's based at the University of Oslo right now, too. So his research focuses on why music makes us move, and he investigates that by using different motion sensing technologies. He's also using analytical knowledge and tools to create new music with both traditional and very untraditional instruments. But maybe most importantly for us today, he's also really pushing the boundaries of open and participatory research, and is implementing open research practices in really all stages of his research projects. So Alexander, we're looking so much forward to hear about your open music research between art and science today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm super excited about talking to you about about this topic on open music research. I will present a little bit about my background, and then turn to more of the open music research part. I'll also touch a little bit upon more general open research examples and practices, and then with some issues about copyright and privacy, which are also very important when it comes to this, because there are kind of limitations for, they set some limitations for what we're able to do. And then I'm not going to talk for an hour. I will talk for much less than that, and I do hope that we can have a good conversation then after my introduction. So, as was mentioned, I'm splitting my kind of self into different things. The music researcher and research musician thing I will get back to also. I'm also running a center and a lab here at the University of Oslo. I'll talk a little bit about RITMO, and then also the open research part of things that I also spend quite a lot of time on, and I think it's important to push for. But a little bit first about my center. This is a very interdisciplinary center, comprising people coming from the Department of Musicology, Psychology, and Informatics. So we are covering 3 departments and 3 faculties also here at the University of Oslo. We are a relatively big center these days, more than 50 full-time researchers working at our center, so it's a good crowd. And this is for the opening, so we have just kind of sent off our first kind of generation, you could say, of RITMOanians, and then we have a new batch coming in now as we kind of in our 5th year now of existence. And we are mainly working on different approaches to understanding what human rhythm is, and to try to understand how that also how human rhythm is used by human cognition, but also how human cognition itself is also kind of can be used for understanding more about the concept of rhythm also in society at large. We work with different themes, as you see here, and also we have 3 empirical areas that we work with: music, motion, and audiovisual media. Not going to say a lot more about what we do. It's more about perhaps a little bit about how we do it. We have a very kind of diverse set of methods that we are using. So we like to say that we are covering and working with everything from the kind of the softest soft to the hardest hard, with more humanities approaches, with reading and writing books, sound and music score analysis, interviews, questionnaires, motion capture, pupillometry, eye tracking, EEG, fMRI, different types of machine learning, and high performance computing, and also robotics. So it's a very large set of methods under our roof. And we are particularly proud of now that we are able to also combine these methods in different ways. That is a great benefit of having a center like ours. It's also a challenge because there are very different theoretical and methodological paradigms kind of meeting on a daily basis. So we kind of work with all these kind of different approaches in smaller groups. We have lab-based things, as you see here, meetings, workshops, seminars. We like to also go on tours, etc., organize research concerts, and I'll get back to that in a little while. And of course, it's important also to have fun and enjoy ourselves. That's also part of our daily life at our center. But enough about RITMO. In addition to that, I'm also the Norwegian representative to the EUAs, that's the European University Association's Open Science Committee. So I've been involved in also pushing for development of open science perspectives for a few years now, including international European policy making here, and also in particular also reward and recognition systems for handling this. But sorry, that's for another time. I should also mention that I do see a difference in the terms open science and open research. Coming from an arts and humanities perspective, I think that the research, calling it open research, is more inclusive. That's not to say that science is not a good term, but I think there's a slight difference in the terminology here, and I think we should just be aware of that as we're moving forward. So I will probably talk more about open research, but so I know that others call it open science. In any case, a typical research process is that we start with an application, then that leads to some kind of research happening, and then you have an output. And in what has been common up until now is that the application process is typically completely black box. You don't hear anything about that beyond the people involved. The research part has been also mainly black box, and the output part has been kind of grayish, you could say now. We are getting more open access, and research outputs are becoming increasingly open, but there are still many things missing. So if you think about the different parts then making up this puzzle, there are many different things, and there are probably even more than I put here, but you could think about opening all of these in different ways, even from the application point of view. I could imagine that you're applying for funding for a project and that the application is actually open to everyone to look at. You could think about also having an open assessment of that application so that everyone would know what's going on, complete transparency. Then if you get funding then and start your research, you may also open the different parts of the research process itself, everything from having open notebooks to open method, open source, citizen science being part of this as well, of course, open data and different how to do that. And again, open peer review manuscript when you start with the writing process, publications, of course, and also the rest of the kind of ecosystem you could say, with open citations and open scientific social networks, and again, open assessment on the other side of all of these things. So right now, most of these are kind of closed or kind of limited in various ways, but I mean, it is possible to imagine a future where all of this would be open. That should say this disclaimer that opening all of these may not necessarily be a good idea in all cases, but it's still an interesting idea to think about whether opening some or all of these would improve research in general. And I'll get back to some examples here. Now, from a music research perspective, though, how can we do this, and what would it entail? I'm going to give some examples now. I think some of these are also relevant for other fields than musicology and music research, but there are some particularities when it comes to our type of research that we need to overcome to be able to make it more open. First of all, when it comes to music research, I mean, there are different things we're doing. And that's kind of getting back to this idea of being a music researcher versus a research musician. So when it comes to the latter, then you can do research on your own musical practice. And here we have an example of 3 PhD fellows from my center working in the lab and kind of preparing for performance, and where the making music is kind of both the process and the method used. It's kind of artistic methods being employed, and also the result of this. Another example is the kind of more research on other people and their musical experiences, more from the outside, which could be both of musicians and audiences. And this is from a research concert we had a couple of years ago, where the musicians also wear some sensors. So you see the percussionist over there, he's wearing a kind of breathing sensor, and the same is the harpist, and also the audiences were also wearing sensors, where we do research on their activity levels during the concert. And then finally, you could think about more traditional research, if you like, and more scientific normal experiments. And here's an example from the eye tracking lab we have, where it's possible then to study how people watch and listen to a music performance. In this case, Glenn Gould playing the piano on the screen, and then you would use eye tracking and pupillometry to say something about the musical experience of watching this audiovisual material. So to summarize these things, then we can talk about then music researching as research on others' music, where music is kind of the research subject, if you like. Then you could also think of research musicking, where you research through your own music, where musicking is a method and music is the result. And in both cases, you would, in terms of the data that we would work with, you have sound, video, scores, text, sensors, and it could be other things too. So it's also a very complex set of data that we're dealing with, multimodal data set, as it's often kind of popularly called. And there are some challenges here when it comes to many, many different things. Now, why would we do these things? And I'll just give you a couple of examples that could be relevant. So if you think then of the sound and video that may be recorded and that we have access to, then that we would like to make openly available together with the research result. And currently, the main research result that is recognized in the world is that of publication. So you would have kind of a publication where you would write something about what we have done, but typically this is done on paper or on the screen with text on it, which works for some things, but not for everything. Being a music researcher, we would often also like people to actually see the video and listen to the sound of what we have been studying. And from a kind of replicability and kind of verification perspective also, reading about music psychology, for example, and kind of how people experience music without having access to actually listen to the material that is kind of the main part of the study, is not a very good idea when it comes to kind of the verificability of the results that we are talking about. So ideally then, we would like to include, for example, a video recording of the performance that this research is based on inside of the paper, if that's possible on a web platform, or at least as some kind of complementary material to this study. Of course, there are some technical challenges on how to do that, but they are not the biggest ones. We are talking more about privacy and copyright issues, and we'll get back to that. Now, when it comes to then copyright and also using this material, we could think of another context where to the left here we have a study where we are looking at a string quartet playing classical music. So that's kind of more of a standard kind of scientific study. To the right, we are talking about a study which is artistic research based, where the idea is that the authors here have been writing a paper on their own musical experience, and we'd also like to include sound and video into this. And there are some challenges also with this, particularly also when it comes to what type of licenses, for example, to use on this material. Because one thing is to be able to share this type of material so that it would be possible to understand more about the actual content of this publication. Another is to allow for using this material in another context later on. how to do that really in practice. So say that from this recording from the paper to the right here, which is a performance we did here with local people, we need tools and solutions for adding this to our research archive, where we typically today you can put a PDF. I mean, technically speaking, it's not really a problem to put in a video file either, but it's something about linking these things up. And from our perspective here, the paper is more supporting and kind of explaining the research process, but the actual research product is the performance that we had. So it's something also about the way these systems work, that they don't really acknowledge that the main research output was a concert. Now we write a paper about a concert, and we may at best kind of have a documentary evidence of the concert as it happened as a media file attached to a PDF which describes it. So there is something kind of fundamentally wrong, I think, with the logic behind how these things are stored and recognized at the moment. So at least we are able to attach this video file, but then what type of license should it get? And what type of limitations do we have when it comes to using these things? So when it comes to license, then think of this situation where we want to run then a more traditional scientific experiment in the lab, and we want to use material from one of our concerts as source material for such a study. And this is kind of a nice way of doing it, because we could go out and choose any type of material that is available out there. Then we may get into some copyright problems, but also then we don't know that much about the material. We would like to, at least, and we try to do, to control all the chains, all the part of the chain here, from the actual recording of the original source material that is also being used in a later study, because then we can also study all of the different parts of the chain. Now, then if you think of the sound, then say that we want to set up a psychology experiment where we want people to listen to the music from this performance that we had in our lab that we have recorded. One thing is then getting the rights to actually use the original sound material and play it back to people again, which is a challenge on its own. Then we may also want to modify this. Say that, for example, you want to understand whether changing the loudness of the sound will influence people's perception of the music being played. So we want to modify it. Then we take the original audio and we modify it a little bit. In this case, just change the amplitude. That would be considered. A modification of the original material. It's a very small modification, but still you change the original material. Then we may also want to actually chop this thing up to, for example, say that we want to reorganize the music slightly so that we would be able to look for order effects, for example. And if you listen to this thing here and this thing that, what happens if you change the order of these things when they were played? Again, a very small modification of the original music, but still you're chopping up the music and you're kind of playing it back in different ways. You could also do more alterations to this. You can change, for example, the pitch, the speed. You can modify the harmonic content of the audio, etc., to make slight variations to study how different, for example, the key. Say that we transpose a song up from, say that the original sound is the music is in the key of D minor. We can change it to F minor or G minor or A minor or something else, and want to study these things. Again, these would then also be changes to the material. And we can chop it up in even smaller parts and combine it in different other ways. Now, this would then require that we have some kind of license that allow for remixing the material. And that's also why, for example, also only using kind of the more permissive licenses will not work, because we are not allowed to remix and use it in different ways. So this is something that is important to think about when choosing a license, because you may not understand the possibilities that the material will actually allow for if you are putting a too permissive license on it. On the other hand, we also don't want to exploit musicians and artists, etc. So it's a challenging thing really to decide on what to do with it. And for those of us making this type of material ourselves, we also need to kind of think about our own material, not only others. Now, to complicate this even further, I'll just like to present a concept we have called Music Lab, which is a concert series that we have developed between the University Library and RITMO here at the University of Oslo. And this is an innovation project when it comes to really pushing the boundaries for what open music research could be. So at the core of each music lab, we have a concert in a real-world setting. So it's a real-world concert with real-world musicians playing a normal concert, really. In addition to that, we also like to have some kind of workshop prior to the concert. We also like to have an educational component to it so that we add a panel discussion, for example, after the concert. But most importantly is also that the actual concert is also a place for data collection. So we've had multiple of these concerts over the years, and for each of them we have been exploring different topics, for example breathing and pulse and movement and other types of topics, and they have been on different musical genres and having different types of musical setups and being in different locations. Again, they have been tailored to kind of really explore what's going on in real-world music scenarios. Now, through this work, we've also realized that it's quite complicated to figure out how to also share these things openly, because ideally, from our side, we would like to make all of the material available for everyone to freely use in different ways. Now, that has turned out to be quite challenging. One thing is that of privacy and GDPR. So this is from one of the music labs in a pub or a kind of basement where people were drinking beer and then enjoying the concert. And we wanted then to do data collection of people in both the audience and also the musicians. Now we can imagine that there are many GDPR issues when it comes to this, recording people in a setting like this, also drinking alcohol being an element of that, and also trying to figure out, okay, what type of recordings could we make in such a setting? Now, we have worked on this for some time and tried to figure out ways of handling this so that we are able to do it. And we come up with a solution where at least we can split the people involved into 3 groups, where we have group 1 being the kind of the general audience, where we have been using general video filming. We've also been testing thermal cameras and IR-based sensing, where we are filming from a distance in the dark, and where the aim is not to study individuals, but when the aim is to study, for example, how people move generally throughout a performance, and kind of be able to quantify that kind of at a large scale level later on. And we have managed to get ethical approval for this. Based on that, we need to inform about this. We put up signs. We talk about also if you're in the space, you will be filmed, but from a distance, etc. So it's more of a silent-based type of consent for doing this type of work. Then we often also have like a separate group of audience members that are using on-body sensors, where we typically don't collect any personal information at all, but where they consent kind of through normal means to being having their some kind of data collection happening to them. And then of course we have the performers that we also film and have on-body sensors, etc., in different constellations. So we kind of broken it down into these kind of groups, and that have helped in sorting out some of the privacy issues alongside. Now, in addition to that, we have copyright issues, and this is not a small topic, and it's actually something that we are working on very hard at the moment, trying to figure out how to handle this, because just to take one example here from Music Lab 2, where we had this was a classical concert, then looking at the copyright issues involved in this performance, in this concert they played many different pieces, I think 7-8 different pieces. Some of the pieces were made by dead composers. For those dead composers that died before 1930 something, the pieces are in the free, so that's not really a problem with them. But for all the dead composers that died after that, the copyrights are typically held by their families and family members, and then you need to figure out, okay, who's actually holding this copyright and what do they how do they want to handle it? Sometimes it's also handled by by some commercial company or by a publishing house. So it's really kind of, it's difficult really to even to figure out who's actually holding the rights to the pieces themselves. Then and the last piece of this concert, and the performers, they actually improvised, so they made their own new piece and would be then also be composers of that improvised piece, which makes it even more difficult. Of course, the performers have their own rights to the performance they just made, and one of the challenging parts there is that at least in Norway, many performers are organized in a musicians union where they don't control their own rights. It's handled centrally by this institution. That in one way simplifies things, because then it's at least one organization that we can talk to. But again, it also complicates it in the way that a single performer may not necessarily be able to allow for the open reuse of material and sign that off themselves. So we need to go through bureaucracy to handle that. In this case, we also had a visual artist that did something where you have the same thing on the visual side. And then we also found out that the combination of sound and video together is called synchronization, and is something that is handled separately from these other discussions. In this case, for this concert, we didn't have a dancer, but in other cases, we also had dancers, and you may have another performing artist. And then the complexity of handling and just understanding and figuring out who actually holds the copyright for all of these different things is really quite complex. So as researchers and want to try to do research primarily, we are really bewildered when it comes to how to clear the copyright, just to figure out who actually owns the copyright to these things. We're happy to pay for things, but we need to know what to pay and to whom. And also, we are not in a position where it's possible to set up like a counter and pay by, for example, the number of downloads. I mean, that we would never be able to get that through the university system. So we need to have kind of some kind of general system for handling also payments. And then we also need to have technical solutions for how to register these things. And finally, also then figure out which licenses to use and put on all of these things, and who should then kind of put these licenses on what. So it's a fairly complex situation, and there are very many organizations and people involved. So here on the right side here are some of the, from a Norwegian Scandinavian context, some of the unions and organizations that deal with copyrights. On the left side, there are, it's also kind of this growing tendency of various types of Creative Commons, Audio Commons, and various types of open kind of creative licenses and systems. That is kind of a totally different way of handling all of this. And the challenging part here is that we need to kind of balance between also two different logical systems, one being that of universities and kind of the research world, where people often have salaries and kind of where the aim of sharing things openly is considered a benefit to everyone. And then on the other side, there's also a lot of freelance composers, musicians, etc., whose income is coming from money based on the material that they produce. So we also want to be providing a living for these people, but we need to do it in such a way that we are able to also kind of push forward on the open research side. So there are many issues here, as I've seen. I have also written a paper called Best versus Good Enough Practices for Open Music Research, where I address some of these things in more detail. So feel free to look up that. There I also discuss a little bit more also on the handling and the technical handling and how to also verify these things, but also the privacy and the copyright issues that I just talked about. But I'll leave that for you to read on your own. And yeah, I think I'll end there so that I leave some time for a discussion and hopefully also some feedback on how to move these things forward. So thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Alexander. Please, everybody, if you have any questions, if you could post them in the Q&A box. I think we were thrown at a lot of information now, so we're all digesting. But while we are waiting for the questions in the Q&A, of course, I have a question. what would you say? So there are so many barriers, right? You've been talking about trying to push the boundaries of open research, and of course there are privacy concerns, there is copyright, and all the issues around that. What do you think is the first step now to sort of move forwards with pushing these boundaries even further, right? Even though these boundaries are still there.
No, that's a good question. I think at least what we have been trying to do with the Music Lab series, and we are continuing that, is that we are trying to just do it, because I've been also sitting in developing policies and kind of general documentation and trying to come up with solutions for some time. But one thing is developing policies or kind of institutional things for these things, but trying to actually do it makes you also realize that there are some things that you can actually do, and there are some things that are even more problematic than you thought to begin with. So for example, when we started out with the Music Lab, we found that privacy was the most critical thing to handle right away. So that's where we spent most of the time in the beginning, to try to sort out the privacy. And in the beginning, we just got a blank no to do recordings in a concert setting. And then after some time discussing back and forth and coming up with solutions, talking to lawyers, etc., we figured out, well, it might actually be possible to do it, as I described there, with splitting it up, having clear signs, and kind of trying to also do the data collection in such a way that you try to protect people's privacy, but also that we're able to achieve the research goals that we want to do. So, and that has been positive, I would say. Not that it's not necessarily simple to do, but at least we have been trying to find some solutions. Then on the copyright side, that's where we're working mostly at the moment. There it's very challenging, because it's so complex, and there are so many parties and people and institutions and involved. So it's really challenging to understand how to approach it, really. So what we have done in a Norwegian context is that we have, a couple of years ago, we had a workshop with many of the central institutions in Norway about this, to try to at least just address the problem and kind of see that we have a problem and agree that we have a problem. I see that particularly the challenge that we are moving between two sectors, the university and higher education sector on one side and the cultural sector on the other, which have totally different logics and totally different meeting places, etc., has been something that we have been working on and trying to provide a meeting point between these. Now, on the 15th of November, we are organizing a Norwegian workshop where we again kind of trying to invite people to join for a kind of continued discussion on this, where we broaden this out to not only talk about music research, but also talk about artistic research in general, which complicates things even more. But on the other hand, we might also start to realize that, well, these commonalities, etc., may also help us move forwards. At the same time, there are various things happening in Europe with the new copyright directive and the Digital Services Act, etc. So there are many things happening at many different levels and with different logics. So without being too pessimistic, I think that we still need to just jump in and try to see what we can actually do to at least find smaller parts here and there and make these things open. For example, to share our own material in a way and have other people use it, etc., so that we can also show the value of these things, because that's ultimately an important thing for moving forward. I think, is that people see that this could be a benefit for many.
Absolutely agree. And I'm also really happy that you mentioned all these new upcoming legislations, right, that are that we're supposed to have in place soon-ish. And this also shows that it's such a dynamically developing field that maybe something that it's a barrier now will not be a barrier next year, or the other way around. We also need to be prepared that you know, because the law is now catching up with all the developments of digitalization and everything. We also need to be prepared that some things will be changing. So I think that's a really, really important point. And there is a question for you, whether we could imagine an infrastructure that both provides access to copyrighted material in art-based research, while at the same time secures provision for the copyright holders, for instance, by issuing payments based on access statistics, so that we could have sort of everything in one place. That's how I understand it.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I guess the way most, I mean, streaming services, I mean, like Google, YouTube, Spotify, etc. I mean, they are based on a model where artists get paid per view or watch or listening, etc. That's possible for services that have an income, subscription based or advertisement based, as YouTube, for example, etc. For a university system, for example, I mean, that's a more difficult situation because our funding is provided for by typically a research funder, and you have money for a certain period of time, and then the funding is gone. And then, of course, a university cannot commit themselves to kind of continued payment to artists, I mean, say 30, 40, 50, 200 years after a research process has ended. So I think for research-based things, we need to come up with some kind of lump sum payment for material somehow, plus a combination of some kind of license that allows for reuse for research purposes, but does not kind of exploit the artistic work of artists in such a way that they wouldn't be able to have a new living. But as I see it, often when we do, for example, a sound recording at a concert, a video or sound recording that is well made for research purposes and for analysis may not be, or is quite certainly quite different from a recording that you make for a kind of normal music distribution. I mean, we typically, when we do video recordings, we work with cameras that are kind of still. We want to have boring lights if possible, no changing lights. Also on the sound, we kind of prefer to have general type of sound or very closed up sound to be able to discriminate between different instruments. That's typically not what people would listen to on Spotify, rather the opposite. So in a sense, also the quality of the material that we are working with is very different than the quality that you find more from an artistic perspective. So that would also perhaps help in the discussions to show that, well, even if we make a concert available as research material, people may not want to put that on in their living room to listen to. They may still prefer to listen to like a Spotify recording that is made for that type of purpose. But again, it's something about we need to develop solutions and systems to handle this, both at the technical level, that could be at universities or in countries, if you have kind of national wide type of repositories, or even at the European scale. I mean, now with the European Open Science Cloud, for example, I mean, there's interest in trying to figure out how to connect various types of services around Europe, and also to provide for also this type of material to be shared there. Then we need to find technical solutions, but we also need to have the support for kind of metadata and kind of the normal kind of preservation type of things that would happen in libraries to go along. So there's a lot of things to work on, really, but the positive thing now is that we see things moving, and we are pushing what is possible, and I hope also to get more people involved in trying to explore the possibilities here.
I like how you, every time you sort of arrived at the conclusion that it's so overwhelming and there's so much work, you always sort of finish with, well, but we should still be positive about it, right? And we should still keep going, and we should still keep doing it. But of course, I can easily imagine that for a lot of researchers, that sort of motivation, that sort of very strong motivation and this very positive approach can be very difficult, right? I mean, there is constantly this talk about incentives, right? And and you know, how much work people would actually like to put into and energy and effort, right, into pushing these boundaries. I think there are not that many researchers that would like to allocate so much time and energy into that, even though they see the huge benefits. I don't know how you think we should be motivating them to do that.
Well, I think this is in general when it comes to open research, not only for music, which is a particular case, but I mean I think many researchers are and have been drawn to working openly because, first of all, they feel it's the right thing to do. I mean, given that many of us are paid with tax money and it's nice to give something back to society. But also for the transparency of the research process and also for helping other people again, because I mean, if other people open access their things, including data and music, etc., that, for example, we can use in our research, that would be a help to us, I think. The general idea about making data openly available and or at least fair is that in general, I think data is not analyzed enough, right? I mean, there's a lot of data lying around that hasn't been properly analyzed and used. So there's a huge potential there where people can save time on doing their own data collection and rather kind of spend time on analyzing and working with material that's already existing. Plus also the benefits of connecting different types of data sources in various ways. So that's one element there. But of course, then as soon as you start feeling these hinders when it comes to both the kind of technical solutions and support services and copyright and privacy, etc., I mean, you feel overwhelmed, and you can realize that, well, I just want to do my thing and finish. So I think pushing for these things is not that, for example, PhD students should do. I mean, I mean, some of us that are in a position to kind of really push forward need to do that work, I think. Individual researchers, PhDs, postdocs, etc. I mean, they need to work with whatever they have in their system. I mean, they should of course also push, and I think many of the really cool initiative things is coming from PhD students. But of course, given the challenges of being an early career researcher, I mean, you need to kind of find the right balance. Fortunately, in parallel to all the work I mentioned now, I mean, we are also making a push when it comes to incentivizing these things and kind of changing the reward and recognition system as well, so that in the future you will also get recognition for doing this type of work, I hope. And there is a change there already, and I think that will happen, and that will also help. But I mean, again, research is based on not everyone can do everything. People are different, and I think that's also one of the things that we will need to develop more as we go. I mean, running universities and building up a research community at large is about putting together a lot of different pieces in a large puzzle, and we need to kind of figure out the right pieces and where they should fit. And right now we're at the point where things are changing quite rapidly. If you look just 10 years back, I mean, the whole open access publication system was completely different, right? We're still at the turning point where the data side of things is on a move, but there are many things that aren't sorted out. But again, if you look 10, 20 years ahead from now, if somebody watches this video, then it would be interesting to see where we are. And I think things will be very different in 10, 20 years from now.
Yeah, hopefully it will be. Alexander, I have a question. So we know that the problems we have in science in general across the fields, and which were the reasons open science has been addressed to address those problems. So how would you describe? So we have problems in all the fields, or yeah, we can say that. How would you describe music research in terms of the degree, or how is it going slow or fast in terms of applying open research practices? Because the fields also differ in terms of that, as I know. So,
well, I mean, music research is covering very many different things, from historical musicology, working mainly with historical sources, etc., to various types of score-based and sound-based approaches, to the embodied music cognition things we're doing, and also, of course, all the performance arts, etc. So It's difficult to talk about everything in one go, but I would say that in general, there has not been so much focus on openness in music research. And I think that also goes back to all of the dilemmas that I've been mentioning here now, because when you have often people talk about privacy as being hindering for sharing data, for example. That's been acknowledged, I think, quite broadly, and universities in general have worked quite a lot on trying to figure out how to handle privacy matters. On the copyright side, I feel that there is still very little that has been done. There has been focus on patents and kind of that type of intellectual property rights work, which is a bit different than kind of the copyright issues that I'm talking about here. But there's still relatively few that kind of have an overview of all the challenges, and there's little support available, and researchers in general are therefore perhaps also kind of have decided basically not to deal with it at all. They've been trying to kind of work around it. So that's kind of my general impression, is that I see in some of the more experimental music technology research communities that I'm involved, people have been very kind of embracing open practices for a long time. I mean, in one of the communities that I belong to, I mean, it started in the early 2000s and then it has been open from the start. Everything has been, I mean, what I've been describing. So there is just natural, and it's the way everyone is working, but that's a very minority. In most other cases, I think researchers have just kind of said that, oh, this is just too difficult. I cannot spend my time on this. They just decided not to share any music or videos or anything really, because that's just the easiest way to do. So that's just kind of the sad story there. But we are trying to move it now. So again, I'm positive. I think we will get somewhere.
That's very much appreciated. But also because that field has this unique two perspectives, right? The artist perspective and the researcher perspective. And do you see, you know, the field is one thing, but do you also see differences in artist perspectives and musician and researcher perspectives? Because I can imagine that is the artists who care more about the copyright, you know, protection of their works, and you know, they obviously they want to be paid for what they produce. So my intuition would be they're more hesitant to put everything out in the open, whereas it's the researchers that want to push for that openness. Is there that tension in the field, or how does it look?
Yeah, I think that's a good observation in general, because I mean, if you think about artists that are not researchers but that just want to kind of live from their art, I mean, they obviously need to protect their whatever they are doing to make a living. I think some also freelancers are interested in making things available, because there is a small community of reuse as well, where you can share things yourself and then also you can use other people's material, etc. So I mean, this is kind of the whole glitch community and kind of reuse hacker community type of thing is different, but in general, artists trying to live from commercial rights and doing concerts and working with kind of normal distribution companies, etc. They certainly have to think about how to share their material in kind of controlled ways. Then the challenging part is with artists that are both working in institutions and doing freelance work at the same time. Either as, for example, coming in to do a PhD in artistic research, and then they know that they will go back to become a freelancer again after they've done their research. I mean, during a PhD, I mean, then you have a salary and you can kind of afford to, for example, share things, but then you also know that you may also need to do concerts and prepare material that will potentially be released and that you need to live on afterwards. And then you also have permanent faculty like myself, where I have a salary, so for me it's okay. I don't need to make a living out of whatever I do, and I can share it openly. So I think there are different kind of approaches there and interests. And you also have some of the really big artists and players that have decided, for example, make multi-track recordings of their music available because they think it's cool and fun, and have other people remix it. But of course, that's easier said than done, perhaps, and it's kind of more for those really, really established artists that they have enough money anyway. So yeah, no, it's a challenge really there.
I can easily imagine. And I also know there are these communities of digital artists where there's also this tension on if you use, I don't know, programming, right? Use code for your art, for creating your art, and then, you know, making it open source, since you're also getting inspired by others putting their code out there and sharing the code. Since it's such a, there is you know, huge sharing culture among programmers, right? But then artists, of course, want to protect their work. So there are some really interesting developments there, I think, and the sort of all that gray zone between just being fully open versus being like very, very protective, and sort of how we can do both, right? How could we develop practices for allowing people to share things openly, but also get full credit for what they created, right? And here, of course, there come licenses and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think licenses is a key here, and I think the general knowledge about licenses is quite low in the research community. People have heard about Creative Commons, for example, but not that many people know what it actually means and which one to choose, etc. I mean, sometimes you say that, well, you should put on CC BY and then everything will fine. Others kind of choose to try to protect things as much as possible by using, for example, okay, I don't want any commercial people to take my and use my work, and then you put on a CC by NC, the non-commercial thing. But then you don't realize that many researchers are also working in, for example, a private university or university college, or a research institution that for some reason is considered kind of private in that sense. And then those researchers are not allowed to use the material because it has this non-commercial license. And then also others, again, put this, by default, put this ND, the non-derivative part on their license, which again makes sense because they don't want other people to kind of mess up with their thing, and that's fine, I guess. But then that would also prevent the type of psychology-oriented experiments that I talked about earlier, where we are not interested in remixing the music and selling it to someone else, but we are interested in, for example, modifying the material in such a way that we can run a psychology experiment and test different hypotheses. So there are some issues there, but in any case, at least putting a license on it would help in kind of understanding how the material can be used. And I think in whatever kind of repositories that we are working with, I think we should have a granularity where it should be possible to put both privacy and a copyright kind of clause on every single file that we upload in different systems, and then have some kind of system where it checks what you're allowed to do with the different things. And we can even get systems that can help us in identifying potential problems along the line, because if you're building on some other people's work that has some kind of license and then you put your own license on it, there may be a conflict there, but you can also have a system that can predict possibly future challenges with that type of license. So that's kind of a more of a systemic thing that would be interesting to develop. And talking about all these licenses and big data, is that machine learning is an interesting kind of component on top of all this. How to handle licenses from also when you really deal with big data. And here we have some interesting examples now at RITMO, where we have, just to mention one project by Tara Adam, a PhD fellow here. So he was recording guitarists in the lab coming in to perform and play. He recorded them in our motion capture lab, and then he trained a neural network to recognize what the guitarists had played. Now, if you take those improvisations that these guitarists had made, and he also recorded the original source audio, but what he actually trained the network with was kind of also all the snippets that he kind of broke this music into. And then this is now kind of residing inside of a neural network, artificial neural network, with all of this material from all of these guitarists just kind of put together and merged together. And then furthermore, he's been using this neural network in performance, where then a machine is playing through the neural network snippets of all of this material coming out again. Then we had a music lab where we had a human musician playing with a machine musician trained with this neural network. And then we started discussing the copyright issues related to this, right? Because then the human musician performing would obviously have copyright of his own material. But what's the copyright of that neural network algorithm and the snippets inside of there? Is that how should you be able to somehow break that down into the 30 or so guitarists that kind of have provided material that have this network have been trained on? Is it Chara's work? I mean, after all, he programmed the whole thing, did the whole thing, etc. Is it his kind of copyright? Or does the machine have some copyright on its own somehow? And how do we handle these things, right? When this is a PhD fellow that will now leave RITMO, what's RITMO's role and University of Oslo's role in all of this? And how can we be taken further and used in different contexts? So it's an extremely interesting case of a very high level of complexity. So that's one example. And then another example was that last year we worked with a Norwegian-based young singer-songwriter called Ari, and she provided us with lyrics and music from all of her tracks, and we trained a neural network to then recognize and produce new lyric and melodies in kind of her style. So that was kind of very much kind of her own machine learning based system. And then you can press a button and then kind of the machine would just come up with new versions of her lyrics that sounded more or less like her, and then she also even recorded one of these. Then the question is, of course, I mean, it's all based on her voice and her kind of tone, etc. But what type of copyright do we, the researchers involved in this project, do we have some kind of copyright in all this as well? And how can this thing be used as we move on? Yeah, again, just to kind of show some of the complexity of this type of work that we are doing.
Absolutely, since of course the machine learning creations are creative creations, right? Those are not. This is not just reproduction of what the artist did, right? This is creative creation, and now I guess it will depend on the developments in the AI field. When are we going to be more inclined to say that AI is something independent that can create on its own, in a way? But we're running out of time. We don't have any more questions in the Q&A. I don't know, Tamara, if you have any more questions from you?
No questions.
All right. All right, but then if somebody does watch this video in 10 years, what Alexander do you think is the ultimate goal for, like, in the next decade, right? If they watch this video in 10 years, where do you think and where do you hope open research is for music research, or generally, right? Like, where are we in open research?
Well, first of all, I think and hope that in 10 years from now, we're not talking about open research at all. We're just talking about research, and that by default, it is open. So that's one thing. Then I also think that the European Open Science Cloud will have developed properly and have become a very strong and big infrastructure that support researchers, both on the technical side, where we have a high level of granularity. We have ORCIDs or personal IDs on all the researchers. We have IDs on all the different materials we have. All of them, again, have privacy and copyright kind of tags to know what works well. And all of this somehow combined with hopefully some kind of general agreement that we can get to with the cultural sector, where it's possible to provide artists with funding and money for their work, while at the same time allowing to make material available for research purposes.
Well, let's hope for that. I will definitely try to watch this video in 10 years, and let's see where we are at. Fingers crossed it will be, your vision will become true. All right, I think we should wrap up. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. The recording will be posted very soon on Riot's YouTube channel. Tamara posted link to the Riot's YouTube channel in the chat. Thanks so much for joining, and join us for another Riot's Norway meeting in November. We'll still be talking about open research related topics, but this time a slightly different perspective.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
See you next time.